everybody. My name is Robert Baer. I'm the Vice President and co-founder of Spiritual Awakenings International, and thanks to everyone for attending this conference. We've had just overwhelming participation, and thank you. We just had a great opening ceremony and presentation, and now we're going to turn it over to Catherine Lucas, who comes to us from Spain. And Catherine is the author of 4 books on how to move successfully through crisis and harness the transformational power it holds. She's a former university lecturer. Catherine left her academic career behind to step into her soul's deeper calling following a profound crisis of awakening. She set up the UK's Spiritual Crisis Network, which is still going strong 15 years later, although she is no longer on the board of directors. This year sees the 10th anniversary of the publication of her seminal text in Case of Spiritual Emergency, Moving Successfully Through Your Awakening. Her media appearances include BBC Radio, Time Warner TV, and she regularly speaks internationally. More recently, Catherine has initiated the publication of the Open Letter, The Rebirth of People and Planet in a Time of Global Emergency, along with an accompanying petition to the UN. She is also the founder of Co-Creating Our Future, which delivers online group programs as well as an upcoming symposium later in 2021. Her work has been described as visionary and pioneering, and we are so blessed to have her with us today. Thank you, Catherine. Please take it away.
Thank you, Robert, for the introduction. And yeah, I feel blessed to be here too. And I want to thank not just Robert, but the whole organizing team for doing such an amazing job of putting this event together. And I'd like to show you how we can, in Zoom, show our appreciation. So if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see you've got the chat, and then over to the far right, you've got reactions. And so under reactions, you can clap, you can show some love, some support with the heart or the thumbs up. And yeah, so let's give the organizing team a round of applause, because they certainly deserve it. And if that's a bit too much, then you can just wave your hands. So yeah, thank you. And I want to thank you, the audience, for being here, because of course we couldn't do this without you. Without you, there'd be no event. So give yourselves a pat on the back for being here. Acknowledge yourselves for being here, for giving up some of your Saturday to be here. So I love to start by just taking a moment to breathe together. To just bring our energies kind of into alignment and into coherence. And just take a moment, if you've got yourself in gallery view, just take a moment to look around at all these beautiful faces, all these beautiful people that have gathered from all over the world. And you might like to put in the chat actually whereabouts in the world you are, because it's always fun to see just the huge range of just how we're covering the globe. So yeah, take a moment to look around this circle, and we can imagine all of us like in a circle, maybe even holding hands, and know that when we come together as a circle, the impact of our collective power and energy isn't just the sum of the number of people in the circle. It's not just the kind of number of people here, but that is actually squared. That number is squared. So it magnifies our impact, our power, our energy. And that's our potential. That's what we're bringing here today. And, you know, we've had some very inspiring words already with the opening ceremony of just what we can do together. So I'd also love to get a sense of how many of you kind of identify as having been through some kind of spiritually transformative experience. And, you know, this could be just a glimpse, just an aha moment, or, you know, some of you maybe have been through some major kind of crises and kind of a crisis of awakening, what we also call spiritual emergency. But can I just have a show of hands? Can we maybe just see, and I'm just very briefly going to put myself into gallery view so that I can just see, so some of you are using the reactions as well. So, and some of you, so a lot of you. I kind of suspected that would be the case, actually. And how many of you have a sense that kind of right now, you know, that we're at a crossroads? Maybe you're feeling called to step up in some way, but you're not quite sure how. You know, maybe you're looking, have a sense of, you know, well, what's my piece of the jigsaw? What's my contribution to this global awakening? So how many of you have a sense that maybe there's something that you haven't quite figured out, that needs to shift, that you want to step up, or that you're still processing? So yes, a lot of hands going up again. Yeah, okay, thank you so much, everybody. It's really helpful actually when you do interact, because obviously presenting in Zoom is very different from presenting in front of a live audience. So I'm really dependent on you, for kind of being here with me so that we can really connect kind of heart to heart. So yeah, and I also want to kind of really reassure you that it absolutely is possible to figure out what our piece of the jigsaw is, and what our soul's deepest calling is. You know, like Rabbi Simcha Raphael was saying just a few minutes ago, you know, we've all felt the call in some way to make the world a better place, to offer our contribution. So yeah, so that's, you know, it absolutely is possible. And I'm going to show you in this session today, I'm going to show you, you know, how we can do that. In a very kind of practical, simple way. So let's go on a journey. Let's go on a sacred kind of pilgrimage, sacred journey. So give me a thumbs up if you're up for coming on a journey with me to Egypt. We're going to go to Egypt. Yeah? Great. Okay, I'm seeing some thumbs up. Fantastic. So let me share my screen, and we're going to visit Egypt. So here we are in Egypt, one of the most spiritually potent and powerful lands on earth. And so, you know, you're with a group of people, and your spiritual teacher. And we're staying in Luxor at a hotel that's right on the edge of the sacred river Nile. And we're visiting some of the just awe-inspiring, jaw-dropping sites in the Valley of Kings and Queens. And, you know, it's powerful stuff. It's very powerful stuff. And at a certain point, you have a vision. At a certain point, you have a vision of Avila. Okay, so Avila comes from the Buddhist pantheon. Avila has 1,000 eyes. I don't know if you can see in the image, but each hand in the palm has an eye. So 1,000 eyes to see all the suffering of humanity. Okay. And what happens as you have this vision of Avalokiteshvara, what happens is that you experience what feels like the entire suffering of humanity going back to the beginning of time. So that's a lot of suffering. That's pretty overwhelming, yeah? The good news is that Avalokiteshvara also has 1,000 arms and 1,000 hands to to help relieve that suffering. And then a few days later, you're stood looking over the River Nile, and you're watching the sun dancing on the waves. Okay, and so it looks almost like rain. You can see the light. It almost looks like rain. It's kind of like each tiny little shaft of light is kind of landing and bouncing off the water and dancing. And you're mesmerized. You're kind of transported. You're in a trance. And it's one of those times where, you know, a minute becomes an hour and an hour becomes a minute. It's just timeless. And as you're transported like this, as you're watching this incredible sight, so it's kind of like a wake-up call, and suddenly everything that you know to represent your physical kind of self in this 3D reality falls away. So your physical boundaries, your sense of ego, personality, persona, it just all falls away. It just melts away. And you experience yourself as energy. You experience yourself as space, just pure space. And you're reaching up like far, far high up into the sky and across the river, like way across to the other side of the Nile and beyond. And it's, you know, it's a big river. And so you experience yourself as you truly are. And that moment transforms your life. So, thank you. Thank you for traveling to Egypt with me. This is just a very brief glimpse of my experience in 2003. Now, I've only been able to give you a tiny taste of what that week in Egypt was like for me, of just how, I haven't really been able to give you a sense of just how incredibly intense it was, and what a roller coaster it was. And in fact, you know, what I went through was so kind of emotionally and physically and psychologically, spiritually, on every level, it was just so overwhelming that actually my legs gave way. And for a few days, I lost the use of my legs. I couldn't even get to the toilet. I had to use a wheelchair for a few days, and I ended up traveling back home using the wheelchair. So you'll see shortly why I wanted to share just one small section of my experience with you, because I'm going to use some of that to highlight the points that I want to make. So let me tell you what we're going to cover. We're going to, you know, this is our theme. This is the title. It was a bit of a download, actually. I can't take the credit for the title. Our time has come, and absolutely, you know, this is. Sorry, I just need to. Well, maybe I can't right now. I'm just trying to change my view a moment. Okay, that's better. Great. So yeah, our time has come. And so I want to kind of talk you through, you know, why I believe our time has come, and, you know, what that means for us individually, but also collectively. You know, for those of us that do identify as having been through some kind of spiritually transformative experience, or maybe even some kind of crisis of awakening, then, you know, why is it that our time has come? And what does that mean for us? You know, what can we do about it? So I'm going to cover these points, and I also want to unpack for you. My apologies if I've used a little bit of jargon here. You know, lead from the emerging future to co-create in the quantum field. If I just briefly unpack that for you, Basically, lead from the emerging future is a phrase that I've borrowed from the Presencing Institute and the work of Otto Scharmer. And it refers to the fact that we kind of, through our connection with Source, we kind of sense into what wants to emerge, what wants to emerge in our own lives, but also obviously that impacts on the collective as well. And it's something that I think I was probably doing unwittingly. And then in the last 2 or 3 years, I've started kind of working with much more consciously. So to give you an example, now there is something that we can call a spiritual emergency community. There is a field of spiritual emergency, this term that Stanislav Grof coined. But actually, over 15 years ago, when I set up the Spiritual Crisis Network, and then when I wrote my first book, there was very little, other than some kind of academic research, there was very little out there to support people. There wasn't anything that we could call a field, really, of spiritual emergency. And then co-creating in the quantum field. I'm using the term quantum in quite a loose way. Probably kind of physicists wouldn't maybe approve of how I use it. But basically I'm talking about co-creating with Source. So we co-create, collectively when we work together collaboratively, but we're also co-creating with Source the whole time. And the more we can do that consciously, the more powerful it is, and the quicker and easier the results that we get. So, and those of you that are a bit more familiar with my work, maybe, and it's lovely, by the way, to see some familiar faces here, as well as lots of new ones. But those of you that are a bit more familiar with my work will know that, I am pretty focused on, just the practical and concrete. Kind of results focused, as well as very much honoring the process, totally honoring the process and the inner journey. So we're going to look at these 3 areas. I'm going to touch on each of them relatively briefly. So we've got the relationship between the personal and the planetary crisis of awakening. And what I want to show you is, if we understand how the personal process works, this crisis of awakening, this kind of spiritual emergence that kind of, just creates the momentum for a shift in consciousness. If we understand how it works at the personal level, we can learn a lot about what's happening right now at the planetary level. We can really extrapolate a lot. So, we've got the individual and the collective, we've got the micro and the macro. So we're going to look at that. And then we're going to look at the 3 key stages of moving successfully through crisis. And this, my first book kind of focuses very much on that. There's a lot more detail in there if this resonates with you and you're interested in it. And so I want to also just speak to where, I see that we're at currently with the global process of awakening through crisis. Because, I think hopefully we can all agree that we're in crisis. We're in the global emergency. And I'm not just referring to the pandemic. I mean kind of like beyond, the bigger climate emergency, which is far more threatening, actually, and is a spiritual emergency. So, and then finally, we're going to look at my signature system, the Quantum Quest, which is what I've developed for helping us kind of really create the kind of shifts that we want to really have the positive impact in the world that we want. We, as Rabbi Simcha Rafa was saying just now, goodness only knows. We need everything that we can in terms of turning things around. And so to co-create in the quantum field where we can do that and get really powerful results relatively quickly and easily, it's like I see it, I guess, if I was really going to I think I would almost say, I see this as maybe our only hope, because if we try carrying on with our kind of 3D solutions at one level of consciousness, then it's just not going to be enough, and it's not going to be soon enough. and that kind of, I guess that refers back to Einstein's famous quote about we can't create a shift from the level of consciousness we're currently in. So, excuse me a moment. So at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a little while so that you don't get PowerPoint fatigue. And yeah, if it's okay with you, I'd like to just share a little bit more about my personal journey so that you can see how it informs my work, and also yeah, so that you can see why I'm passionate about what I do. So is that okay with everyone? Maybe kind of give me a thumbs up or a high five or whatever. Great. Okay. So, and I think also this will help to put the Egypt kind of episode in context a little bit, because I realized it was slightly kind of out of the blue. So, you know, basically, as Robert was saying when he introduced me, you know, I'm the author of 4 books about how to harness the transformational power of crisis. So this isn't just about moving successfully through crisis. It's about really, you know, kind of creating a shift, a considerable shift, because we go through an awakening of consciousness and then our life has to kind of catch up. So, you know, all my work has come directly out of my personal experience. I've been through profound crisis on several occasions. And, you know, through this process, I've been able to kind of really kind of create the kind of life of my dreams, I guess. I've been able to step into my soul's deepest calling. And yeah, and, you know, that hasn't always been the case. So, for example, you know, when I was 20, I ended up, I went through my first period of spiritual emergency, and ended up on an acute psychiatric ward for a month, and effectively lost a year of my life, gradually weaning off the heavy-duty medication that I was put on. And so, you know, I think at that point I was kind of really floundering. You know, what I was going through was pathologized rather than recognized and appropriately supported. And, you know, I think, you know, again, to put that in context, I come from a pretty dysfunctional, wounded family. My father was an alcoholic, and, you know, he was very abusive, emotionally, psychologically, and verbally. And so, you know, it's no wonder really that I, you know, with the men in my life, I started creating quite kind of dysfunctional, abusive relationships. So, you know, those early years of mine were hard. And that's putting it mildly. But fast forward 20 years, when with the Egypt episode, and it was a whole different story. You know, after that period of crisis, I was able to just completely kind of transform my life, and you know, and there were various things that kind of led to that, but you know, this time, rather than floundering, I was really able to flourish. And elsewhere, I've spoken about the different kind of criteria, you know, what makes a difference between why some people flounder and other people flourish. And yeah, so I'm not going to go into that now, but you can find that on my YouTube elsewhere. So I think, you know, this is, bear with me a moment. Okay. I've got a kind of lectern behind me, behind the computer, behind the screen. So I'm giving my trade secrets away here. So you know, today, you know, my second husband and I have been together for 15 years. I feel truly blessed, you know, to have this relationship, which just deepens and blossoms, you know, as time goes on, just gets kind of better and better. And, you know, we live in Catalonia, a couple of hours south of Barcelona. I get to regularly swim in the sea virtually all year round, which just makes my heart sing. And so yeah, it's you know, it's kind of like I've figured out how to do this, but you know, it took me 20 years, and I don't want it to take anybody 20 years, certainly not to take you 20 years. We haven't got 20 years, you know, we haven't got that, you know, we really need to kind of be moving swiftly and confidently forward in terms of our global emergency. And you know, and also what I really needed at the time was somebody to kind of show me, you know, how to kind of recreate my life, how to kind of, because effectively I ended up upgrading it, but like, well, how do you do that? And this is the work. This is what I'm so passionate about now, is kind of supporting people to do that, whether that's kind of working one-to-one with clients, depending on what stage of the process they're in, or you know, through my group programs, helping people step up into their deepest calling, and into leadership if that's what they feel called to. So that's just a little bit about kind of why I do what I do. So let's take a moment to look at this relationship between the process of kind of awakening through crisis at the personal level and the planetary. Okay, and there are certain kind of defining features of when we go through this process at the personal level, and you'll see, you'll see. I want to draw out the parallels. Okay. So let's look at these, and again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail because I spoke about this at the IMEC conference last year in 2020, and so you can go and find that. You can go and find that in the. I'm just going to put that in the chat. So that's my link to my YouTube. So yeah, this, you know, in terms of these defining features, what are we looking at? You know, what's it like when we go through this at the personal level, and what does that teach us about what's happening now globally and collectively? So one of the first things really is the sheer intensity, and you know, we can certainly. You know, you can see that. You know, I mentioned that I ended up in a wheelchair for a few days because what I was going through was just so intense. And if you think back to the beginning of the pandemic, you know, I think we'll all agree that when the pandemic first kicked off, it was pretty intense. And then in terms of the speed with which things happen, you know, I went through an incredible shift. I mean, it took me a long time to process that 1 week in Egypt, but the speed with which that happened in 1 week, and then if you look at the pandemic, I'm using the pandemic as an example really of kind of what's happening in the collective globally, so that you can see some of the parallels. And then with the pandemic, you know, that happened virtually overnight. And, you know, everything that is familiar can get stripped away. So for me, through my process, you know, there was a point when my first marriage got stripped away. I moved out of my marital home. I stepped away from my academic career. You know, everything that was familiar was stripped away. And we can see that with the pandemic as well. You know, it's like, you know, suddenly overnight, the kids can't go to school, we can't go to work, we can't socialize with family and friends. And yeah, so it's like everything familiar is kind of stripped away. And this is part of the process, actually. It's kind of what needs to happen for the awakening, for the process. So as uncomfortable as it might be, it's actually part of the process. So it's almost like, you know, I want to kind of reassure you that almost like everything that's been happening with the pandemic has been happening for a reason. For how I see it, it's to really help and contribute to this awakening of consciousness. And you know, in terms of some of the other defining features, you know, the shadow comes up. You know, certainly at the personal level, a lot of our repressed shadow material, our unconscious wounding and patterns comes up to be healed. And, you know, during, you know, last year, we saw, and this is still kind of, you know, still very present really, we saw the shadow of systemic racial injustice coming up to be healed and, you know, to be addressed and healed. So that's another a key aspect of it. You know, it provides an opportunity for the shadow to be addressed and healed. It's like everything comes up to the surface and erupts like a volcano with all this kind of molten lava and ash kind of spewing everywhere. You know, it's a pretty uncomfortable process. You know, let's face it. And fear, you know, one of the key characteristics of this process at the personal level is just the abject terror, because, you know, we have egos and we're so identified with our egos that we feel, it's like the ego feels so threatened. Sometimes we feel as if we're physically going to die. And unfortunately, with the pandemic, we have seen a lot of actual physical death as well, tragically. And yeah. And what else? Fear, and then our values and our priorities changed completely. You know, I had to completely rethink my life because my priorities and my values, kind of what mattered to me, had completely shifted. Especially if you bear, you know, I didn't mention, but if you think that I came from a very secular family, you know, I did not have any kind of spiritual upbringing whatsoever. So those are just some of the kind of key defining features and characteristics. And then there's also some key kind of stages of the process. So let me, at this point, I will share my screen again. Yeah, so we're going to go on to the second point now, the 3 key stages of moving successfully through the crisis, and where I see that we are currently in the process. That slide is just summarizing what I've just been talking about, actually. So let's have a look at this, the 3 key stages of moving successfully through crisis. So the first one is very much, you know, we're in emergency mode. We're basically we just need to get through the crisis as best we can and stay safe. And, you know, and in emergency mode, we're totally focused on the solution. So, you know, at the personal level, we're reaching out for support. You know, we're looking for information about what the hell we're going through, and that. And you know, in terms of the pandemic, you can see that, you know, we've been very focused on staying safe, and we've seen our total interconnectedness in terms of how our behavior and actions impacts on those around us in the community. So we kind of really got a physical experience of our total interconnectedness, you know, this kind of quantum field in which we're all totally and utterly connected the whole time. And also, you know, I think with the pandemic, we can see how, you know, we've been very solution focused. You know, never probably have we developed a vaccine quite so quickly. And then the second stage, and by the way, this is not a linear process. You know, we can move in and out of these and backwards and forwards. So I don't want you to think that it's linear in any way. But the second stage is making sense of it. It's kind of really integrating, you know, integrating what we've been through. Like, what the hell was that all about? And what does it mean for my life? And this may be resonating. You know, I imagine this is resonating with some of you in terms of what you know, your experiences. And a very powerful model for working through this is Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. You know, Joseph Campbell, the mythologist, he really popularized the hero's journey. And it's, yeah, I mean, I myself used it at one point when I was feeling very stuck. I took a 3-month sabbatical and really worked with it to help me kind of get unstuck and move forward. And there's a particular phase, you know, in the hero's journey, there's a particular phase called the approach to the innermost cave. And Joseph Campbell says, the cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek. Ever the mythologist. And, you know, the approach to the innermost cave comes before the supreme ordeal. Okay, it's almost like a kind of pre-crisis. It's a kind of warm-up crisis. You know, I mean, I can laugh about these things now because I'm not in crisis right now. But you know, it's pretty full on, and it's kind of preparing us for the even more profound crisis of awakening. If this is, you know, your kind of, you know, I'm talking at the individual level, but I'm also talking collectively now, because, you know, one perspective on this is that the pandemic is kind of the approach to the innermost cave, and that actually, if you look at the climate science, there is far, far worse to come. And I don't want to say this to create any fear for you, because I think, you know, the wonderful thing about this community and the fact that we're all kind of coming from this kind of transpersonal spiritual kind of base is that we know that, you know, that there's nothing to fear except fear, really. You know, we can have this total trust, this total faith. I mean, obviously we've still got physical bodies, we've still got egos to some extent, but we're much less likely to get sucked up into the fear, caught up in the fear. We're much less likely to kind of buy into the drama of mainstream media and news. And so that's partly why I feel we have, you know, those of us here, you know, we have so much to offer. This is why our time has come, because we're less likely to get caught up in the fear, caught up in the drama. And so we can kind of just move forward in faith and trust and be solution focused and kind of just get on with the work that needs to be done. And don't get me wrong, you know, this is not, it doesn't have to be hard work. You know, it's kind of like we can do it with joy, we can do it with a light heart, because we need to be connecting with our joy. And when we're stepping into our deepest calling, we do that joyfully. And that's all we need to do, you know. We don't need to save the world. Maybe I've said this already. You know, we don't need to save the world. All we need to do is step into our own personal deepest calling. And that's our contribution to helping turn things around. So I'd like to, because this is such a special event, such a special weekend, I wanted to offer you something. And so think of it as a sample. Okay, think of it, I had somebody gave me a free sachet of skincare recently, a sample, so that I could try out this new product. Actually, this isn't new. But it's certainly, I've just created this especially for the Spiritual Awakenings International Conference, yeah, so think of it as a sample. Think of it as a sample, as a way of trying out, working with this model of journaling. So basically, this is. Yeah, it's an introduction. It's my introduction to how you can work with the hero's journey and how you can journal with it to help you kind of make sense of what you've been through and process and work out wherever you are on your journey, what's your next step? You know, how do you want to kind of move forward? So, yeah, and that's the link just there. And I'll put that in the chat shortly as well. So what I'd like to suggest at this point, I normally kind of, at this point, I would normally, yeah, I think it's good for us to have a little break. Rather than taking questions right now, maybe take this opportunity. What I'm going to do, I was going to play some dance music so that we could move our bodies and just have some fun, which is what I regularly do in my kind of workshops and trainings. But I then realized we might have a copyright issue. So I'm going to play some music, a beautiful chant from the Indian Vedic tradition that is from some friends of mine, some very dear friends, Bharati and Dinesh. And so that we can just have a break for a couple of minutes And you might like to, while it's playing, you might like to write any questions in the chat that have come up for you during the first part of my presentation while they're fresh in your mind. So you can pop those in the chat. Or you might like to pop over and just go and grab that free gift straight away, because I've done it just for the conference. I'll be taking it down on Monday. So let me stop sharing my screen, and I'll play the music and I'll pop that in the chat. And yeah, just take a moment to kind of just kind of land and connect with yourself and have a little bit of a breather. So this is a chant for Mother Earth. My apologies, folks. I forgot to unplug my earphones. I'm so sorry. Bear with me while I just plug myself back in. So my apologies for My apologies for stopping that halfway through. It's beautiful, but it's actually nearly 7 minutes long. So now I saw a question in the chat, which I was very pleased to see. Somebody's obviously been paying very close attention, because somebody asked, what's the third stage of moving successfully through crisis? And let me see who it was that was asking that. Ank, yeah, great question. I hadn't got there yet. That's why you kind of weren't sure what it was. So fantastic that you noticed. So the third stage of moving successfully through is basically, we've got over the worst of the crisis. We've done our best to start integrating it and making sense of it, and that can take many years. And then at some point, we're ready to go back out into the world. We're ready to re-engage with our life. And into hero's journey terms, we're ready to kind of bring back the learning, it's called the return with the elixir. We're ready to bring that back to the community, because we don't go through these experiences for ourselves. I mean, obviously on one level we do, but actually we go through them for the collective, because we have so much to offer once we've been through these kind of experiences. And this is what I really deeply, passionately care about, is that when people have been through this, that they then, they have so much to offer, they have so much potential, and the world desperately needs that. We need people that are awakened, to whatever degree of awakening. So that's the third key phase, and that's a big question, really. Can we bring it back? And obviously, I don't want to put anybody under kind of any pressure in any way. It's very much whether you feel pulled. But in my experience with supporting so many people through this, virtually everyone feels called to be of service in some way once they've been through this. And that takes a myriad of different shapes and forms. We each need to find our own piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So, and then let me share my screen again, because at this point, this is where the quantum quest process comes in. Bear with me a sec. Here we go. So that's the third key stage, going back out into the world. So we've looked at the relationship between the personal and planetary. We've looked at the three key stages, and now finally I want to look at the kind of quantum quest. And this is kind of like my signature system, what I've developed of kind of how we can kind of find what our piece of the jigsaw is and kind of really step powerfully into that in a very easeful way. We don't want it to be hard work. We absolutely don't. And in fact, as one of the key things is to have plenty of downtime. When we're working with Source, we need time to connect with Source through our spiritual practice. We need relaxation time. We need our hearts to sing. We need a lot of joy to keep our vibration high, so that we can really be very powerfully and effectively co-creating in the quantum field. So this is these are the three key phases. I seem to do things in threes and come up with these key stages and key phases. So the first is hearing the call, is just kind of really clarifying, what is it that is mine to do? What is my work to do? What makes my heart sing? And there are quite a few pieces around that, which I haven't got time to go into now. But there's a whole way of kind of getting in touch with that, sensing into it, expressing it and languaging it in such a way that we really can, that we can, Source can meet us halfway. Or in fact, often what I've been finding is that Source is one step ahead of me. That's this kind of leading from the emerging future, really. And then the second key phase is the inner journey. And again, you know, this is not a linear process. We kind of need to be working on these, maybe overlapping at the same time, moving backwards and forwards. The inner journey is where we, through our spiritual practice, our gratitude practice, whatever it is that kind of really helps us at a vibrational, energetic level to operate in the quantum field. And then the final piece, and this is the piece really, I think, you know, the other two phases, the first and the second phase, certainly the first phase I've been working with really consciously for a long time, just setting very clear intentions. I'm a real believer in the power of that. And then the inner journey, I think I was probably doing it maybe a little bit less consciously, but certainly, you know, that was what was there. And then the final phase, you know, this quantum jump. This is the piece that I've added in the last 2 or 3 years, and I call it the quantum jump because it has just been such a game changer for me. And yeah, I mean, it's really what we do here is we do a mini version of whatever it is that we're feeling called to. You know, the Presencing Institute, Otto Scharmer, you know, they call it prototyping or piloting. Tara Moore calls it a leap, taking a leap. But these are, you know, my group participants, you know, sometimes they talk about baby steps. You know, this is, they're tiny little baby steps so that we're not getting stuck in too much fear. Because if we've got this kind of big vision of what we want to do, then a lot of resistance and fear is going to come up. It's going to feel overwhelming. Whereas when we take a mini step, in getting us in touch with our intended audience, you know, kind of getting feedback, trying it out, then that it helps some of the resistance melt away, any of the fear that might be coming up. And yeah, it's just very powerful. And as I say, it's been a real game changer for me. And by the way, you know, these are not, you know, these are kind of tried and tested. It's not just me I mean, this is my particular version, if you like, but these kind of principles have been around for a long time. So I'm just going to, in terms of timing, I'm just going to whiz through 1 or 2 slides.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Robert. So yeah, so this was in terms of me hearing my call. I heard a very faint little call last year to do the open letter, which Robert mentioned when he was introducing me, to reach out to colleagues, the rebirth of people and planet in a time of global emergency. And then that has led to much bigger things, you know, a petition to the UN, and then a global online summit that we're working towards for the autumn this year. Which is, the title is Birth the New Earth. And actually, if you want to get that, if you want to grab that free gift, the link that I put in the chat earlier, that's a good way of also getting onto my mailing list, and then you'll get details of the free summit automatically, if that is of interest and resonates with you. So I've talked about the second phase, and I've talked about the third phase. So that's pretty much, we've kind of covered things. I know I've gone through the quantum quest very rapidly. What I sometimes do is, yeah, by the way, I'd love to hear in the chat, you know, maybe share in the chat anything that you're taking away from the session today, because I'm wrapping up. And yeah, any insights, any aha moments, just what you're taking away. It would be great to see some of that in the chat. It would be, yeah, really helpful for me. Very kind of supportive, yeah. And so sometimes what I do with the Quantum Quest is from time to time I offer free workshops so that I can really take you through the whole blueprint of how the system works and what the different pieces are, so that you can start applying it, you can start working with it. Again, I wanted to really offer something very special. As I say, I do sometimes offer these. So I thought, okay, well, I'm going to offer one for all of you here today. And so that's on June the 24th, Thursday, June the 24th. And again, I'll put that link in the chat shortly. And yeah, you might like to go and do that, just while we're going, getting ourselves organized to take your questions, because we've got about quarter of an hour for your questions. So you might like to pop over and just it'll take less than 2 minutes to register for that, if it resonates, if you're interested. And yeah, great. As my husband says, if it takes less than 2 minutes, do it straight away. So, and then finally, normally what happens at this point is, I love to connect with people individually. So when it's a physical conference, people come up to me and I have a chat with people, and we can't quite achieve that level of interaction today. So do drop me an email. You've got my email address there, Catherine@catherineglucas.com. I'd love to hear from you. Just what resonates, share a little bit of your story, whatever. And also, typically at this point, you'd have an opportunity to buy one of my books, and I would sign that for you. Now, again, we can't do that today, but next month marks the 10th anniversary of In Case of Spiritual Emergency, moving successfully through your awakening. And so I'm doing a book giveaway next month. I'm going to give away 10 copies, one for each year. And yeah, if that is of interest to you, then again, get yourself onto my mailing list, because I'll be sharing details of that through my mailing list. So, either by signing up for the free workshop or signing up for the free gift, either will get you onto my mailing list. And that's going to be fun, doing a book giveaway. So thank you very, very much, everybody. Let me stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for being such a responsive, interactive audience. I really appreciate you being so attentive, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Are you ready for them?
Absolutely.
There's a couple questions on Egypt, and one of them is from me. So we'll take the low-hanging fruit first. Your journey to Egypt, did you feel you had been there in a possible former life? And if so, did you have any memories that might have been realized or triggered while you were there?
That's a fantastic question. I love that question, Robert. Thank you. I have worked through a lot of past life material. In terms of my shadow material, what I had to unfortunately deal with, and it was really horrible to have to process it, was a lot of sexual violation. But that wasn't to do with Egypt. That was now that's another kind of whole story, really. I worked with the wonderful Dr. Roger Woolger before he passed over. Such a beautiful person. And that actually is what made my relationship today with with a loving relationship with my husband possible, I think. But to answer your question about Egypt, what happened for me was, before I even left the UK, I was living in the UK at the time, I started to feel the energy, and now I think the language I would use is like the consciousness that came through. And I'm not suggesting this was a past life by any means, but certainly the consciousness that came through was, I started to pick up on kind of like an Egyptian pharaoh that was a woman, that was a queen, and like a pharaoh, and I thought, hang on, how does this work? And so I googled and researched, and what I found was that Hatshepsut, if I've pronounced her name right, it's like hot chicken soup, Hatshepsut, was actually, a pharaoh and a queen without a consort. And so I started picking up on her before I even left the UK. But I'm not for a moment suggesting that was past life. But yeah, great question. Thank you.
I have another one for you, and I think you may have touched on this already, but it's in the chat room. So, to Catherine, what was the third stage of moving through crisis?
Yeah, I have. I've answered that already. And just as a reminder, that was Ank who asked that. Thank you,
Yes.
Ank, for your question. That was, that's kind of going back out into the world. It's when we're ready to re-engage with our life, because typically when we go through these experiences, we can be out of action, for some time. I mean, after Egypt, I was off work for 2 months. And even then, I just completed the project at my job, and I left my job, and I took myself off. And actually, I never went back to a paid 9-to-5 job ever after that. So that was a big shift. But yeah, we can be out of action for a while. These experiences, that we're looking at a kind of long trajectory here in terms of how long it can take to process them. So yeah, I think I've answered that really.
And here's one from Emma in Argentina. Absolutely, Avila, but sometimes this is difficult when one is experiencing fear and crisis. So I think journaling might help some people get to where you are suggesting. Do you have any comments to follow up on that?
Yeah, and it sounds like Emma was responding to somebody who had made another comment earlier.
Sure.
Yeah, so thank you, Emma, for that. Yeah, certainly journaling, a lot of people find journaling really helpful, especially when there's so much going on inside, and, maybe we're having difficulty sleeping. Having a notepad and pen by the side of the bed can be really helpful, because we just get anything that's in our heads down on the paper, and that can help as well. And that's another whole area really to look into. But certainly journaling can be very, very helpful. And it really, as I mentioned, when I journaled with the Hero's Journey, when I took that sabbatical, I took 3 months out and kind of just read and studied and learned about the Hero's Journey, and then applied it to my experience and wrote about it. And that became a section, in my book, In Case of Spiritual Emergency. Then that helped me. It just helped me to get unstuck and move forward. It helped me to really own the gifts, to really kind of own all that I had gained and learned, and just kind of anchor that really in a more concrete, grounded way. It's like, well, how do I take this forward? How do I use it in everyday life?
Thank you. I have one from Yvonne to you. I think you may want to touch on this one more time. Could you please explain again by what you mean by the quantum field?
Sure. So what when we, look at quantum physics, I see there are a lot of people doing fantastic work, bringing the kind of quantum, the quantum physics together with the metaphysics. And they're kind of really what the quantum physicists are saying, are what the spiritual teachers and masters have been saying for millennia, except that now we've got the kind of scientific understanding of it, and evidence and research, and this is way beyond me. I am not a physicist, and to be honest, I think it's even beyond a lot of scientists to even begin to get our heads around the true implications and consequences of how the quantum field operates. And so that's why I think, unfortunately, we do have some scientists who are still maybe reductionist and materialist in their perspective. So the way I use the term is in terms of, it's all about energy. Basically, the quantum says, it's all about energy, it's all about frequency, it's all about vibration. And what that means for us is it's all about our emotional state, our mental state, our degree of joy and happiness and peace and contentment, gratitude, love, unconditional love. All of these things kind of really help us at the vibrational level to operate in the quantum field, to kind of be coherent, because it's, if people are familiar with heart math, they've done a lot of work around coherence, and that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a kind of coherent kind of level of kind of energy, really. And yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, I do use the term rather loosely, I'm afraid, and probably physicists wouldn't approve. And there are some fantastic people doing work around this. Good. So I do have, Robert, if there aren't particularly other questions, I want to speak. There were one or two things that I feel I didn't quite kind of touch on or kind of get across when I was speaking. So maybe I can just take a couple of moments to do that.
Sure.
Would that be okay? Sure. Great. Thank you. So, the title of this session is Our Time Has Come. And I just wanted to speak a little bit more to what I mean by that, and why, I just want to speak to it a little bit more, basically. So, I mentioned that, we have a slightly different perspective because, we get it. We understand what's happening. We see that the world is awakening. We see that it's a painful process. We see that it's through crisis. This is, crisis is really the catalyst and the driver for our awakening and our evolution. And those of us in this community, those of us that are gathered here, we kind of, we get it. And so we've got a huge amount to offer because we can help, people who are maybe getting more caught up in the fear, caught up in the drama, who don't see the bigger picture simply because they've, nobody has kind of, maybe they've just not had that opportunity on some level. And one of the things that's happening is that more and more people are kind of becoming ready to kind of wake up. More and more people are kind of waking up and searching and going through crisis. And so it's, this is why our time has come. And I mean, maybe I've already said it, but, we have so much to offer. And I feel that, our community is, it's very beautiful what we have to offer and the difference that we can make and how we can do that. And, hopefully I've shared some tools and approaches and methods that can help each one of us individually to step into that. And, we don't, as I said, we don't need to save the world. All we need to do is step into our soul's deepest calling and let our heart sing. And that will create the shift. That will be a huge contribution to humanity and to moving through this global emergency, this crisis of awakening. So, Robert, do you have any more questions? Because if not, we can leave it at that and give people a little bit of a longer break, maybe.
I think we'll do that. But first of all, thanks for coming to us all the way from Spain. You did a marvelous job. It was a great presentation. I do agree that with you, Spiritual Awakenings International. Of course, it's something very near and dear to my heart personally, because I'm one of the co-founders. But I think it's a movement. It's not just an organization, it's a movement. And I think what you touched on is basically the same thing. This is a spiritual movement that's going on right now. That's my own opinion.
Yeah, and actually, Robert, sorry, can I just say something?
Yes, you can, sure.
Because one of the things that's happening, and this is what's so exciting, we've had, for a long time, we've had kind of like environmental activists, and then we've had those of us that have been working on our spiritual journeys. And what's happening now is those of us that have been kind of doing the inner work and working on our spiritual journeys, we're suddenly looking up and saying, wow, we need to step up and out. And the climate activists, environmental kind of sacred activists, they're getting much more of a spiritual perspective. Extinction Rebellion, groups like this are deeply rooted in the spiritual. So we're coming together, and this is what the open letter is about. It's about what the petition to the UN is about, and it's about what our summit later in the year is about as well. So, I really encourage everybody to go and grab either the free gift or sign up for the workshop, get yourself on my mailing list, and then, I can share details of the summit with you later in the year so that we can kind of really bring more and more people kind of into this movement, this kind of sacred activism. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and thank you, Robert.
And to everyone, we'll take a break until noon, and at that time, Dr. Brian Sackett will be next from Canada.